Good morning, plebeians. Today is June the 30th. It happens to be the release and the launch of 9.1. There is what experts and scientists would call, with its original term, fuck all to do this week, pretty much. Just a couple of chain quests for the story, one layer of Torghast, that's about it. So, let's continue what we have been doing for the last couple of days. We went through the range DPS and we went through the melee DPS in observing which of the specs were going to change Covenants. They were going to change Legendaries, perhaps have some different changes in their talent options and their build options based on what was changing in 9.1. Observing, of course, also the impact that things like nerfs were going to have in 9.1. And we have seen some change, we have seen some shift. For range DPS, it was more tuned and centered around entire specs taking over others, like in Mage and in Warlock, for example, whereas for melee DPS, it was more about just the change for the Covenant, the change for the Legendaries, etc., and less underplayed or under the radar specs suddenly becoming powerful. This is obviously more logical. When you think about it, range DPS have very popular and very broadly played classes as a whole: Mage, Warlock, and Hunter. They make up for 70% of the entirety of the range DPS specs, so they are always popular. It's not that Fire Mage is popular and Frost isn't. Fire Mage is popular because it's strong. The moment Fire Mage is no longer popular and Frost is, nobody will have any qualms rerolling from Fire to Frost. When you look at melee DPS, it's much different. You have Survival Hunter, you have Retribution Paladin, you have Windwalker Monk, you have Feral Druid, you have Enhancement Shaman, Havoc Demon Hunter. As a matter of fact, the majority of melee are basically a one-spec hybrid class type of deal, which is much harder to make popular, to turn into a popular spec out of nowhere. So what about Tanks and Healers then? What has changed there? Is there anything interesting and important that we can look forward in 9.1 happening? Any possible prediction, any calls we would like to make related to these two roles? The most important roles, let's remind this always. Let's start with Tanks and let's start with Death Knight. Blood Death Knight is not really gonna change much of anything. They still have their two main general legendaries which will not change in 9.1, Super Strain and Crimson Rune Weapon. Super Strain is primarily for more damage, which is also somewhat irrelevant due to the very low damage that a Blood DK has already. And then Crimson Rune Weapon, which is way more defensive in nature as a legendary. The new additions of the Covenant specific ones for DK, when it comes to Blood, have been actually pretty disappointing. We went already over Frost and over Unholy, and even then, none of the new legendaries are particularly good. We only mentioned Frost DK simply because Kyrian is very powerful thanks to Mikanikos and thanks to the reworked Soulbind tree. But for tanking, not really anything relevant for Blood. Generally speaking, most of the tanks are going to remain Ventir or Necrolord, but it's also very variable. The majority of Blood DKs just settled for Ventir thanks to their Swarming Mist Covenant ability and the ability to just gain and generate lots of runic power, which is very good for a Blood DK, particularly in Mythic Plus. Raid Encounters is a little bit less value, but there shouldn't be any particular change in 9.1 that will make Blood DKs want to reroll, want to change. Same can be said for our current flavor of the month, flavor of the 9 months, Vengeance Demon Hunter. Because of the way the entire build works, to keep it together, they have to keep all the little puzzle pieces together. So Fiery Soul, their main standout defensive legendary, is still going to be the one that's picked the most. To make that work, they will still go Kyrian to take the advantage of Elysian Decree. Similar to Blood DK, probably the two specs with the most disappointing and least useful Covenant legendary additions in 9.1. They are pretty worthless altogether. The only change, but this is not really worth mentioning too much because it's going to be a staple for the majority of specs that will want to go Kyrian or already are Kyrian. Pelagos will remain the strongest Soulbind for more or less all-purpose use and raid encounters and low targets, but Mikanikos currently, in its current tuning, is the new way to go when it comes to Mythic Plus, when it comes to AoE, when it comes to grouped enemies. The particularly powerful thing when it comes to Vengeance, just to point out, Vengeance is pretty reliant on this, and they would actually pretty enjoy this benefit, is the Effusive Anima Accelerator, which is the last trait of the Soulbind from Mikanikos, the extended Soulbind you will be able to get in 9.1. Because in Mythic Plus you will almost always, very high chance to get a 20-second cooldown reduction on Elysian Decree, thanks to this trait. Of course, all of the specs that will go for Mikanikos will be able to get cooldown reduction on their main class ability, and Elysian Decree just so happens to be a very key one for Vengeance, so it's very, very good. They have no reason to move away from Kyrian, or to move away from anything they have been doing so far in 9.0.5. Moving over to Guardian Druid. Guardian Druid has received a tiny nerf, something we mentioned, which wasn't even aimed at Guardians, it was aimed at balanced Druids, and Guardians just got caught in the crossfire. Their well-honed instincts, very powerful conduit, was nerfed by 50% in the effectiveness in the cooldown, so they will be slightly less tanky. But the majority of their tankiness will remain because they also have no reason to move away from what they have been doing in 9.0.5 either. Night Fae and Ursoc's Fury Remembered are going to be the picks for Druid. It is kind of funny in retrospect looking before the release of Shadowlands, where most people were looking down on Earth, mentioning it as some sort of low-level Mythic Plus key, because when you scale at high keys and 20 plus keys and whatnot, this legendary was going to be much weaker because the amount of shielding was going to be too little for the amount of damage you were taking, and instead now we are entering Season 2. Many of the Guardian Druid tanks will be tanking plus 25s and 26s and 27s, and they will continue to go for Earth as their strongest legendary, in AoE situations anyways. Again, another class, this is a pretty significant change from what we have seen from ranged and melee DPS, another class that really doesn't gain too much from the Covenant legendaries. We went through Balanced Druid, pointing out how Sinful Hysteria legendary for Ventir together with Ravenous Frenzy Covenant ability were very powerful, and they could have been used as Balanced Druid. For Guardian, not really. Guardian is similarly to Feral also pretty powerful and pretty reliant as a very good cooldown, an extra cooldown they can use. So they have no real reason to go away from this Covenant, so they will stay more or less the same as they have been so far. Now, okay, this is starting to be a little bit repetitive because when we move over to Brewmaster, Brewmaster has basically received no changes to 9.0.5. It was the beneficiary, like all the other tank specs except Vengeance, of the extra 10% less damage taken. And that's just about it. So with nothing changes and with nothing related to scaling and related to any other type of interactions with their kit, it will make them remain where they have been, which is Stormstout's Last Keg legendary, which is the all-purpose use. If you want to be a Chad, if you want to be a manly man, you can go for Charred Passions for more damage but less defense than Stormstout Last Keg, less uptime on your brews, essentially. Similarly to what we said about Windwalker, Brewmaster is also going to remain Kyrian when it comes to Covenant choice. Weapons of Order is also very powerful for Brewmaster. The other options aren't as alluring. You still have the possibility, because they're not that bad. Both Necrolord and Nightfae do have some pretty decent choices in Feline Stomp and Bone Dust Brew. They have some pretty consistent AoE damage that they can offer in a Mythic Plus key, but in general, for the all-purpose use and the extra defensiveness that you can get in Kyrian, not to mention the 9.1 addition of the buffed Mikanikos 3, it is going to make it pretty powerful. We finish with the 2 protection specs, and now we have finally the first minor change. So, Protection Paladin is not really changing when it comes to Covenant. You do have most of the Paladins still Kyrian, with a few of them being Ventir. There is that option with Ashen Hallow when you play Ventir, but the majority of them will stay Kyrian. Protection Paladin has been known since the release of the expansion, and that has been sort of their niche for a while. Ever since Legion, they were known to be a very high damage output tank. It was sort of their specialty, and that is more or less what they will continue to do. In raid encounters, they can continue to use the Med Paragon for pure single target damage and uptime, or the Magistrate Judgment, also for raid encounters and progression, whereas Mythic Plus, they have kept their 2 choices of heavy damage, Bulwark of Righteous Fury or Holy Avengers and Grave Sigil. The main difference is that the main difference is the same addition of Retribution Paladin's choice, which is Divine Resonance. the new Kyrian specific legendary, which is going to add tons of damage to the possible output you have as a prot paladin, and also some extra defensiveness, the extra bonuses you can get from casting Judgment for free multiple times. It is likely not going to be as powerful compared to Red Paladin, because Red Paladin is generally just going to care about full out damage, whereas prot kind of also has to worry about staying alive. So some of the other legendaries can still give you some pretty good defensiveness, some higher defensiveness, like the Engraved Sigil, which can still give you extra shield, extra absorb shield on your Avenger shield hitting, so it gives you more defensiveness. But you do have at the very least Divine Resonance as an extra choice, a very legitimate choice, and likely still be picked by many of Protection Paladins focusing on Mythic Plus. Again, after going through Vengeance and going through Brewmaster, we have to mention this for prot as well. For prot Paladin, you have Kyrian and you have the fact that you can go Mikanikos. We mentioned the importance of Elysian Decree for Vengeance Demon Hunter. Effusive Anima Accelerator for Mikanikos can also do wonders for the cooldown reduction of Divine Toll for prot Paladin, which is a key ability. And it becomes an even more key ability now that you can run with Divine Resonance, and making it even more powerful. The last of our tank specs, and this is going to surprise you, there is going to be a twist that I left for last. Because this one, Protection Warrior, is actually going to change no Covenant, it's going to change no Legendary, and it's going to stay Kyrian because Mikanikos is strong. I know. Take a deep breath, it's a lot to take in, huge surprise, huge twist at the end of the tanks. But that's just how it is. The majority of prot warriors were already going Kyrian and moving to Kyrian en masse with the addition of 9.1 and the buffing of the Mikanikos tree. There's going to be no real reason to move away from Kyrian. None of the Covenant specific legendaries are going to be worthwhile for protection, as opposed to Sinful Surge that we mentioned for DPS warrior, particularly Fury Warrior, not really for protection. They don't really care too much about last stand duration with Sinful Surge. Same goes for the legendaries. They will still go for the Wall and Reprisal. The Wall for Shield Wall uptime, cooldown reduction on Shield Wall, and Reprisal for extra free shield blocks in Mythic Plus. There is a caveat we have to mention for the Cuckshed build. So the Cuckshed build is the Protection Warrior going Necrolord. Now, if you go Necrolord as a prot warrior, it's because you drank the Conqueror's Banner Kool-Aid. This is particularly after Conqueror's Banner is going to be, or is right now, in 9.1 buffed significantly. Conqueror's Banner is now going to give 400 mastery as well as increased movement speed to 2 other allies. It's a very significant buff, and you can further improve on this buff by going Glory, the new specific legendary for Necrolord, which is going to affect an additional ally. So 50% more targets being affected by this, and you can extend the duration of this banner, so the duration of this 400 mastery buff, by half a second per 10 rage you spend. So 15 seconds plus the extra extension, which can go almost double in duration. There is this possibility. By no metric, the Necrolord build of Protection Warrior is going to be stronger than the Kyrian one, but I'm gonna say this, okay? I'm gonna say this. If you are not aiming in pushing Mythic Plus to any reasonable high key in this season, and I'm gonna stop at plus 20, so if you're anywhere below plus 20, and even more so if you're just content with Keystone Master, so plus 15 level, yes, you need 2000 rating in Season 2 to get Keystone Master, but on average, if you are hovering in the plus 15 level, and what really interests you is Mythic Raiding, so you are more of a raid logger type of tank that doesn't want to do too much Mythic Plus and just wants to raid, Necrolord is actually much better. You don't really care about going Kyrian, you don't really care about the extra damage of the spear and all of the extra cool things you can get from Mikanikos. You can go the Cuckshed build. You can go Necrolord, you can get the Necrolord banner and buff your pals. It's actually a pretty good build if you want to go that way, that route. Now, we have gone over tanks, it's time to go over healers, hoping there is going to be more change and more shakeups that we have just witnessed in tanks. So, just to spice things up, I'm going to start with a bang. I am going to start with Restoration Druid, because Restoration Druid goes from using Vision of Unending Growth in raiding to using Vision of Unending Growth. They go from using Verdant Infusion in Mythic Plus to using Verdant Infusion, and they go from using Night Fae as a Covenant to using Night Fae as a Covenant. That is it, actually. there is no change. None of the Covenant-specific legendaries are going to change too much for you. Vision of Unending Growth, basically your AIDS Rejuvenation legendary, is far too strong in Mythic raiding to pass up with any of the new additions. Verdant Infusion is not that powerful. It's not one of the things that you really want to keep at all costs when you go in Mythic Plus, but none of the new ones would push you to change your Covenant just to get that Covenant-specific legendary, so no real change for Restoration. Now, when it comes to Mistweaver Monk, Mistweaver has gotten buffed. It is the healer that has received the most buffs, that's true. They have gotten their Fist Weaving, so most of their damage to most of their abilities buffed by 10%. They have gotten some mana discounts buffed on their abilities, some other quality of life changes, but they are still playing Mistweaver Monk. That's kind of the problem with the spec. There is also not going to be much of any change when it comes to legendaries. No real change even with the additions in 9.1, Ancient Teachings of the Monastery and Tear of Mourning to be interchangeable between Mythic Plus and Raiding. Kyrian, as well as the Covenant choice, will likely remain Kyrian. Mistweaver, much like the other specs for Monk, to be fair, do have some pretty decent options between Kyrian, Nightfare, and Necrolord. Weapons of Order, Bone Dust Brew, and Feline Stomp are all pretty usable and valuable, you know, after we exclude the existence of Ventir for Monk. All the other three are pretty nice, but Kyrian was already pulling ahead, and now with Mikanikos is gonna pull even further ahead, so not really much is changing there either for Mistweaver. What about the Priest specs? Well, you could expect some change for Discipline because at the end of the day, Spirit Shell is getting a big hefty nerf. It already got nerfed in the amount it can actually absorb, 80% of the healing value instead of 100%, and in 9.1 it's getting nerfed by 50% in its cooldown, from 60 seconds to 90, which is very big for the spec. So maybe there was bound to be some change, so, you know, some variation in how you want to play the spec. And it is actually true, because for a while, because of the whole setup of playing Discipline in raid encounters, a lot of Discipline moved over to Ventir because of Mind Games as an extra damaging ability to use for your Spirit Shell combo. Now more Kyrian Discipline Priests are going to exist because of the new specific Covenant legendary for 9.1, namely Sphere's Harmony. Boon of the Ascended's cooldown is reduced by 2 seconds up to 1 minute for each stack of Boon of the Ascended consumed by Ascended Eruption. The main woes of Discipline up to this point was the fact that while Kyrian was strong, the cooldown was too long, it wasn't lining up properly with Spirit Shell, but now, with this specific legendary, you can reduce its cooldown by a lot, and because you are Kyrian, and because you are Mikanikos, and because you have something we have already mentioned, which is the Effusive Anima Accelerator, you are going to be able to further reduce the cooldown of Boon of the Ascended even more. So you lose Mind Games as a damaging ability, but you do gain Boon of the Ascended, and you can get it to a pretty significant enough cooldown reduction that it makes it worthwhile to play Kyrian. And then we finish in the end mentioning that because you go Kyrian, then you have Mikanikos at your side, which is the further buff, the further benefit of going Kyrian. Very quickly after going Discipline, we have to go through Holy, because much like Restoration Druid, nothing changes for Holy. Flash Concentration is in that spot of being too strong of a legendary to pass up or to even consider the new additions of legendaries, as well as the changes, even the Kyrian ones, for Mikanikos and all of that, are not enough for Holy Priest to move away from Night Fae. The only one that can use properly and fully the Fae Guardians, thanks to also the mana reduction, which is very worthwhile for a Holy Priest. So not really many significant changes for Holy Priest. Then we have the mix and match. We have the melting pot of Restoration Shaman. Restoration Shaman come in 9.1 is not going to change anything in the sense that they can roughly play whatever they want. That's the TLDR. The reason for this is that Ventir has gotten buffed in its ability, Kyrian has gotten buffed in its ability, Night Fae has gotten buffed in its ability, to the point that they can sort of contest with Primordial Wave of Necrolord. And then the new specific legendaries added by 9.1 are also very good for Ventir, for Night Fae, and for Kyrian. So while Necrolord was the main pick, 9.1 buffed the other three options by enough of a margin that it now makes sense. There is a reason for you to play all 4 Covenants. The other benefit for Restoration Shaman is that they have a strong enough base of a kit that they don't have to rely on a very powerful legendary. So Shamans do not really necessarily need Primal Tidecore to be healing. which means they can just go wherever they want. You can go Ventir and play with the Ventir Chain Harvest ability and Elemental Conduit, which is very powerful. It is going to be very powerful in Mythic Plus as a pretty good option. You can go Kyrian with the newly buffed Raging Vesper Vortex, which is also going to give you damage in Mythic Plus, so very valuable. And the newly buffed Night Fae is particularly powerful with Seeds of Rampant Growth, being able to give you up to an extra use of Healing Tide Totem in a raid encounter. If you can squeeze it in, depending on the duration of the boss fight, it's going to be a pretty powerful pick. So you do have plenty of options for Restoration Shaman. The TLDR is that Necrolord is still the safest. Fleshcraft, the newly buffed Fleshcraft, is extremely powerful, especially in raid encounters, especially right now, during Progress, what we will be going over in the next few weeks. Primordial Wave is the best all-round pick for both Raid and Mythic Plus, so you have plenty of options. It's just sad, you know. The only part of Restoration Shaman is just the sadness of you staying Necrolord because it's the safest pick when all around you there are new shiny things to try, which is ultimately the sad part about the Covenant system itself. Me as a Shaman, I would have enjoyed finally trying out Ventir, playing with Chain Harvest with this newly buffed strong legendary, or going Night Fae and trying out the CDR reduction of my Healing Tide Totem and all these cool things, but instead I can't because I am locked in my Covenant and it's just too safe and just too effective to pass up on. It is, though, we have to say, in the end, the more versatile, the more varied, and the one more open to options out of all of the healer specs. Lastly, one who isn't on the same level of Restoration Shaman when it comes to freedom is Paladin. Holy Paladin, left for last, is the one that received quite a bunch of nerfs. Blizzard tried to push a normal hard casting build of Holy Paladin a little bit more out in the sun. Flash of Light has been buffed by 20% in healing. Infusion of Light buffing your Holy Light, or your Flash of Light is now getting an extra charge and 30% increased healing, at the cost, of course, of getting a bunch of damage nerfs. You know, Ashen Hallow, Hammer of Wrath, Judgment, all nerfed by 10%, plus the whole of your damage nerfed by a further 8%. TLDR, absolutely irrelevant. Holy Paladin will still be smoking all the other healers in terms of damage, so this is not going to achieve anything. Which means that, as a result, nothing really is going to be changing when it comes to legendaries. You will still be playing the Glimmer of Light build, so you will still be going Shock Barrier. You could be changing for a little bit more damage, and you can go for the Med Paragon. That is something that Holy Paladins have been doing already, and not too much is going to change there. As well as the Covenant choice. If you want to be a big IQ utilizer of very well-timed cooldowns, then you can just and should just stay Ventir. Because of the damage of Ashen Hallow, because of the strength of the cooldown, it still remains likely the way to go in Mythic Plus. It is still a good pick in Red Encounters. However, Kyrian is still the easier choice. It is likely still going to remain the broader choice amongst Holy Paladins that are not running at the highest level, particularly of Mythic Plus. So the ease of use of Divine Toll, of being able to fully, for example, to fully spread your Glimmer of Light and your Holy Shocks to the entire party in a Mythic Plus key every minute is super powerful. The fact that, and this is now very repetitive, the fact that you are Kyrian, it means you are Mikanikos, which means you get an even further increased cooldown reduction on your Divine Toll, thanks to the Effusive Anima Accelerator trait, so it's going to be very, very effective as a whole. Certainly higher maintained, higher stable HPS when you go for Kyrian. So, at the end of this entire thing, which dragged on way too much, I have to say, we can say these two are the more disappointing of the options. DPS had some changes here and there, had some twists and turns here and there when it came to picks. Either priority, power picks of the spec as a whole to look for in 9.1, or simply changes within the Covenant to pick, within the Legendaries to pick. Tanks and Healers, on the other hand, not as much. Even when we look at the possible power, it does not look like the status quo is going to change by a bit. I don't think Mistweaver Monk has a chance in hell of going anywhere. I think Holy Priest will continue to be a pretty respectable high HPS, you know, very high throughput spec you can use when you don't need, when you're not as locked in requiring many damage reduction abilities, similar to Resto Druid. They have been having this role, this expansion. I still think Holy is better, especially after their reworked Symbol of Hope with the new extra 1 minute cooldown reduction on your defensives. I think it's gonna pull further ahead. When it comes to tanking, I think Vengeance and then below Brewmaster and Guardian Druid are still going to be the ones to look for in 9.1. Now it's time to leave. I should actually stop talking and just go and, like, you know, play the patch myself. So, thank you guys for watching the video. If you've enjoyed this, you should support the channel by playing a tank or a healer in the next few weeks of Mythic Plus, particularly. Otherwise, you can just subscribe to the channel. Thank you either way. See you guys soon, and in the meantime... Oh, actually, never mind. I forgot there is nothing to do the first week of 9.1. So, back to actually playing Griftlands, I guess.